Detective Alistair Davies had walked through hundreds of crime scenes, murders, suicides, accidents that would make most people sick, but nothing had prepared him for what waited inside the Ainsworth house that cold October morning. The moment he stepped through the front door, his composure cracked. The air felt thick, almost crushing. His chest tightened. Something was wrong here. Not just the murder, something deeper, something that made his skin crawl. Professor Eleanor Ainsworth lay in the center of her living room, her body positioned with chilling precision, but it was her eyes that hit him like a punch to the gut. Wide open, glassy, staring at the ceiling with an expression that seemed to scream a warning. Then he saw the message, written in blood across the white wall, the letters dripping like tears. "What you seek is seeking you." Davies felt the hairs on his neck stand up. He spun around, certain someone was watching him. The room was empty. Just him and the body, just him and that message that seemed to burn into his retinas. Have you ever felt like someone was messing with your head, making you question what is real and what is not? That moment when you cannot trust your own senses anymore. This was not just a murder. This was psychological warfare. The killer had not just taken a life. They had crafted a weapon designed to shatter minds, to plant seeds of doubt that would grow and spread like poison. The evidence at the scene was not random. Every detail had been carefully planned. The symbols on the floor were not occult markings. They were fragments of Professor Ainsworth's own research, twisted and rearranged into something that would haunt anyone who saw them. Davies found a tape recorder next to the body. When he pressed play, Eleanor Ainsworth's voice filled the room through crackling static. "If you are hearing this, I was right. They are inside. They know what I know. Do not trust the evidence. Do not trust yourself." The recording cut off with a scream that made Davies's blood freeze. "What you are about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about crime, about justice, and about the fragile nature of the human mind. Hit that like button if you have ever questioned your own sanity, because this case will make you question everything." Professor Eleanor Ainsworth was not from Havenwood. That was her first mistake. She arrived in the small town 3 months before her death, carrying boxes of research files and a determination that would ultimately seal her fate. Eleanor was a forensic anthropologist from the university, sent to investigate a series of cold cases that local authorities had buried decades ago. Havenwood was a town that preferred its secrets buried deep. The residents had learned long ago that some questions were better left unasked. Some doors were better left unopened. But Eleanor Ainsworth was not the type of woman to leave anything alone. Her specialty was reading the stories that bones could tell. She could look at skeletal remains and reconstruct entire lives, entire deaths. She could see patterns that others missed, connections that others ignored. It was a gift that had made her famous in academic circles. In Havenwood, it would make her a target. Eleanor rented a small house on Willow Street, just outside the town center. The previous tenant had moved out suddenly, leaving behind furniture and personal belongings. The landlord seemed eager to rent it quickly, asking no questions and accepting cash payment for 6 months in advance. Within weeks of her arrival, Eleanor had set up a makeshift laboratory in her basement. Files covered every surface. Photographs of crime scenes from the 1970s and 80s lined the walls, missing person reports, autopsy records, police statements that contained more gaps than information. She was investigating the disappearances of 7 women over a 15-year period. All outsiders, all young, all forgotten by a town that seemed determined to erase their memory. Eleanor's journal entries from those first weeks revealed a woman consumed by purpose. She wrote about the thrill of discovery, the satisfaction of connecting dots that others had ignored. But slowly her tone began to change. October 1st. The patterns are becoming clearer. These were not random disappearances. Someone was selecting these women specifically. October 5th. I have requested the original case files 3 times. Each time I am told they are missing or damaged. How convenient. October 10th. The librarian, Thomas Brennan, claims he cannot find any newspaper archives from those years. The microfilm machines are broken, he says. They have been broken for months. October 15th. I feel like I am being watched. Every coffee shop conversation stops when I enter. Every store clerk suddenly becomes very busy when I ask questions. The paranoia crept in slowly at first. Eleanor noticed her lights flickering at odd hours. She would come home to find her research papers slightly out of place, as if someone had been reading through them. Her phone calls would cut out randomly. She began hearing footsteps on her porch late at night. October 20th. Someone has been in my house. I am certain of it. Nothing is missing, but everything feels different. Violated. October 22nd. I cannot sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see faces. Women I have never met, but somehow I know their names. They are trying to tell me something. October 25th. The dreams are getting worse. I wake up with dirt under my fingernails, even though I have not been outside. I taste earth in my mouth. I hear whispers in languages I do not recognize. Eleanor began installing security cameras around her house. She changed her locks twice. She stopped going out after dark, but the feeling of being watched only intensified. October 28th. I found a photograph slipped under my door this morning. It shows me sleeping in my own bed. Someone was in my room last night. Her handwriting became erratic. Her journal entries shorter, more frantic. October 30th. I cannot tell what is real anymore. The voices in my head sound like my own voice, but they are saying things I do not remember thinking. November 1st. I am not alone in my mind. The neighbors on Willow Street began to notice changes too. Mrs. Henderson, who lived next door, told police that Eleanor's lights would stay on all night, casting strange shadows through the windows. She could hear Eleanor talking to herself at all hours, sometimes arguing with voices that no one else could hear. Mr. Roberts, who delivered mail to the street, mentioned that Eleanor had stopped collecting her mail. Letters piled up in her mailbox for weeks. When he knocked on her door to check on her, she would peer through the curtains but never answer. The grocery store clerk remembered Eleanor's last visit. She had filled her cart with enough food for weeks, muttering about not being able to trust delivery services anymore. Her hands shook as she counted out exact change, and she kept looking over her shoulder as if expecting someone to grab her. Here is the lesson we must all learn. Isolation and obsession create the perfect conditions for manipulation. When we cut ourselves off from others, when we become consumed by a single purpose, we become vulnerable. Our minds, designed to seek patterns and connections, can be turned against us by those who understand how to exploit our fears. Eleanor Ainsworth was brilliant, but her brilliance became her weakness. The killer did not need to break down her door. They just had to break down her mind. Detective Alistair Davies had built his reputation on ice-cold composure. 23 years on the force, hundreds of cases closed. Colleagues called him the machine because nothing seemed to shake him. He had worked gang murders where bodies were left as messages. He had processed scenes where families were destroyed in their sleep. He had seen humanity at its absolute worst. But Eleanor Ainsworth's crime scene was different. It was not just brutal, it was personal. It was designed. Davies stood in the doorway of the living room, his usual systematic approach crumbling. The scene felt like a violation of his own mind, as if the killer had reached inside his thoughts and rearranged them into something horrible. The body was positioned with mathematical precision. Eleanor lay on her back, arms spread at exactly 45-degree angles. Her legs formed a perfect straight line. Someone had taken time with this arrangement. Someone had cared about the details. But it was the symbols surrounding her body that made Davies's hands shake. Carved into the hardwood floor, etched with surgical precision, were diagrams and equations that seemed familiar, too familiar. Davies knelt down and studied the markings. These were not random occult symbols. These were fragments of Eleanor's own research notes, twisted into something unrecognizable. Mathematical formulas for calculating bone density, anatomical drawings of human skeletal structure, research methodologies for forensic anthropology. The killer had taken Eleanor's life work and turned it into a monument to her death. On the coffee table, arranged like an exhibit, were pages torn from Eleanor's journals. But these were not the pages Davies had expected to find. These entries were different, written in Eleanor's handwriting, but describing events that seemed impossible. I can feel them moving inside my bones. The voices are teaching me new languages. I know things I have never learned. Davies checked the dates on these entries. They were all written after Eleanor's estimated time of death. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Davies pulled out his phone to call for additional backup, but stopped when he noticed something else. A small digital recorder sat next to Eleanor's body, its red light blinking steadily. The recorder had been waiting for him. Davies stared at the device for a full minute. Every instinct told him to wait for the forensics team. Protocol demanded that nothing be touched until photographs were taken and evidence was properly documented, but the blinking light seemed to pulse with urgency. He pressed play. Eleanor Ainsworth's voice filled the room, but it sounded wrong, too calm, too controlled, like someone reading lines from a script they had memorized. Detective Davies. Yes, I know your name. I know you would be the one to find me. You were chosen specifically for this moment. Davies felt his chest tighten. How could she know he would be assigned to this case? The recording continued. What you are seeing is not a crime scene. It is a test. Every symbol on this floor corresponds to a case file in your office, files you have never opened, cases you have never worked. Davies looked around the room again. The symbols suddenly seemed to shift and rearrange themselves in his peripheral vision. Eleanor's voice crackled through the static. Check your desk drawer when you return to the station. Bottom left. Behind the files you think you remember putting there, you will find photographs of 7 women. You will recognize their faces, even though you have never seen them before. The recording paused. In the silence, Davies could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. They are inside your mind now, detective. Just like they were inside mine. The only difference is that I fought back. I tried to warn someone, anyone. But who do you trust when you cannot trust yourself? The tape cut to static. Then Eleanor's voice returned, distorted and layered, as if multiple people were speaking through her. We are not alone in our minds. The recording ended with a sound that made Davies drop the device. Not a scream, not a cry for help. Laughter, soft, knowing laughter that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Davies stood in the silent room, surrounded by symbols that seemed to pulse with meaning just beyond his understanding. For the first time in his career, he questioned whether he was truly alone. Comment below. Would you have played that tape? Would you have been able to resist the blinking light, knowing it contained the victim's final words? The investigation began with 3 suspects. 3 men whose lives had intersected with Eleanor Ainsworth in the weeks before her death. On paper, they seemed ordinary. In reality, each one carried secrets that made Davies question everything he thought he knew about human nature. Thomas Brennan was the town librarian, 47 years old, soft-spoken, with hands that shook slightly when he poured coffee. He had been the last person to see Eleanor alive, helping her research historical records in the library's basement archives. When Davies interviewed him, Thomas seemed helpful, too helpful. She was obsessed with those old missing person cases, Thomas said, leaning forward in his chair with an eagerness that felt rehearsed. I told her those files were incomplete, damaged by water years ago, but she kept pushing, kept asking for records that simply do not exist anymore. Davies noticed how Thomas's answers came too quickly, as if he had been practicing them. Every response was perfectly worded, every detail carefully measured. When Davies asked about specific dates, Thomas consulted a small notebook that he kept in his shirt pocket. The notebook looked new, but Thomas claimed he had been keeping it for years. Dr. Marcus Albright was Eleanor's academic rival, a forensic pathologist who had publicly criticized her research methods in several published papers. He had the knowledge to create the symbols found at the crime scene and the medical expertise to position the body with such precision. During questioning, Dr. Albright remained calm to the point of being unsettling. He answered every question with clinical detachment, as if discussing a case study rather than a murder investigation. When Davies asked about his whereabouts on the night of Eleanor's death, Dr. Albright provided a detailed timeline that accounted for every minute of his evening. I was at home, reviewing patient files until 11:30. Then I watched the late news and went to bed at exactly midnight, he said, his voice steady and measured. I can provide the television viewing logs from my digital cable box if you need verification. The level of detail bothered Davies. Who remembers their evening with such precision, unless they had been preparing for that exact question? Silas Crawford was a drifter who had been staying at the Riverside Motel for 3 weeks. He had no permanent address, no steady employment, and a criminal record that included breaking and entering charges from 2 other states. Hotel records showed he had checked out the morning after Eleanor's body was discovered. But when Davies searched Silas's abandoned motel room, he found something that made his blood run cold. Pages torn from Eleanor's research notebooks were scattered across the bed. Photocopies of the missing person files she had been investigating were taped to the walls. In the bathroom mirror, someone had written in soap, "She knew too much." The evidence against Silas seemed overwhelming, until Davies realized that the motel room had been left unlocked, accessible to anyone who wanted to plant evidence there. 3 suspects, 3 alibis, 3 reasons to doubt. And then Davies started experiencing what Eleanor had described in her final journal entries. It began with small things. Files on his desk would be rearranged when he returned from lunch. His computer password would stop working, then mysteriously function again hours later. Coffee cups would appear on his desk that he did not remember making. Davies told himself it was stress, the long hours, the pressure of a high-profile case. But the incidents became more frequent, more personal. His case notes would disappear overnight, only to reappear the next morning with small changes. Witness statements would be altered by a single word or phrase that completely changed their meaning. Evidence logs would show items that Davies had never collected. Here is a crucial fact about psychological manipulation that everyone should understand. Gaslighting works by making small, consistent changes to your environment while denying that any changes have occurred. The victim begins to question their own memory, their own perception of reality. Over time, this creates a state of chronic self-doubt that makes the victim vulnerable to further manipulation. Davies's colleagues began to notice the change in him. Detective Miller, his partner for 8 years, started asking questions. "You are not sleeping, are you?" Miller said one Thursday afternoon, studying Davies's face with concern. "When was the last time you went home, really went home, not just stopped by to shower and change clothes?" Davies could not remember. The case had consumed his life completely. He was staying late every night, reviewing evidence that seemed to change each time he looked at it. He would drive past Eleanor's house at random hours, searching for details he might have missed. "You need to take a break from this case," Miller continued. "You are starting to sound like her, like Eleanor, paranoid, obsessed." But Davies could not step away. Every lead felt crucial. Every piece of evidence seemed to hide another layer of meaning. He started carrying a digital recorder, documenting his own thoughts and observations in case they were altered later. That was when he first heard the voice. It was his own voice, but speaking words he did not remember saying, thoughts he did not remember thinking. The recording device would capture conversations he had no memory of having. "Do not trust yourself," his own voice whispered through the static. "Do not trust your memory. Do not trust what you think you know." The manipulation was working exactly as it had with Eleanor. Davies was being systematically isolated from his own reality, cut off from his ability to trust his own perceptions. Here is the life lesson we must all learn. Manipulation succeeds when we become isolated from outside perspectives, when we stop seeking validation from others, when we stop sharing our experiences with people we trust. We become vulnerable to those who would exploit our fears and doubts. Recognition is the first step in resistance. The red flags of psychological manipulation include questioning your own memory, feeling constantly confused or off balance, finding evidence that contradicts your recollections, and experiencing changes in your environment that others deny or cannot see. Davies was losing the battle for his own mind. But unlike Eleanor, he was not fighting alone. The question was whether his colleagues would recognize the warning signs before it was too late. Davies discovered the true scope of Eleanor's investigation when he finally gained access to her personal files. What he found changed everything he thought he knew about the case. Eleanor had not been investigating random disappearances. She had uncovered a pattern that stretched back 40 years. 7 women, all between the ages of 25 and 35, all outsiders who had come to Havenwood for research purposes, all forgotten by a town that seemed determined to erase their existence. The first was Dr. Margaret Chen, a cultural anthropologist who came to study local folklore in 1982. Her car was found abandoned on Highway 9, but her body was never recovered. The police report was 3 pages long, no follow-up investigation. Case closed within 2 weeks. The second was Rebecca Torres, a journalist writing about small-town economics in 1985. She had been staying at the same motel where Silas Crawford was found. Her last known location was the town library, where she was researching historical property records. Thomas Brennan had been working there even then. Eleanor's files contained photographs, witness statements, and evidence that the police had never collected. She had interviewed family members who claimed their loved ones had called them in the weeks before disappearing, describing the same paranoid experiences that Eleanor herself had documented. The women all reported feeling watched. They all mentioned their research being tampered with. They all described voices in their heads, telling them not to trust anyone, not even themselves. Davies was reading Eleanor's notes when the first anonymous message arrived. Imagine opening your mailbox to find an envelope with no return address, your name written in handwriting that looks disturbingly familiar. That was exactly what Davies experienced on a Tuesday morning in November. The envelope contained a single photograph and a note written on hospital letterhead. The photograph showed Davies standing in his own kitchen, taken through his window sometime during the night. He was wearing pajamas he did not remember owning, holding a coffee cup he did not remember making. On the back of the photograph, someone had written, "You are not who you think you are." The note was typed on a prescription pad from Havenwood General Hospital. "Stop looking or join them." Davies studied the photograph for hours. The timestamp showed it was taken at 3:15 in the morning on Sunday. Davies had no memory of being awake at that time. He checked his phone records, his credit card statements, any evidence of what he had been doing that night. Nothing. A complete blank in his memory. The second message arrived 3 days later. This time, the envelope was slipped under his office door while he was in the building. Security cameras showed the hallway was empty during the entire time frame when the note could have been delivered. This envelope contained multiple photographs. Davies at the grocery store, buying items he did not remember purchasing. Davies at a gas station he had never visited, filling up a car he did not recognize. Davies having coffee with Thomas Brennan at a restaurant he had never been to. According to the timestamps, these photographs were taken over the past 2 weeks. Davies had no memory of any of these events. The note this time was handwritten in his own handwriting. "We see you, we know you, we are you." Davies began recording everything. Every conversation, every meal, every moment he could remember. He installed security cameras in his apartment and started sleeping with a digital recorder next to his bed. What he discovered was worse than missing memories. He was having entire conversations he could not recall. The recordings showed him on the phone with people whose voices he did not recognize, discussing cases he had never worked on, making appointments he had no knowledge of. The most disturbing recording was from a Thursday night. Davies watched himself on the security camera, standing in his living room at 2 in the morning, having an animated conversation with someone who was not there. On the audio, he could hear both sides of the conversation clearly, his own voice and another voice that sounded exactly like his own, but speaking words he would never say. "The investigation must stop," the other voice said. "I cannot stop," Davies replied. "She deserves justice."
Justice is not what this is about. This is about control, about teaching a lesson.
What lesson? That some secrets are meant to stay buried, that some questions should never be asked. Davies had no memory of this conversation, no memory of standing in his living room in the middle of the night, no memory of the voice that sounded like his own but felt completely foreign. The third message was the most personal. It arrived on a Friday morning, tucked under the windshield wiper of his car. The envelope contained a single photograph that made his hands shake. It was Eleanor Ainsworth, alive and smiling, standing in front of his apartment building. She was holding a newspaper with a date from 2 weeks before her death. Behind her, barely visible in the background, was Davies himself, walking toward his apartment. On the back of the photograph, "She came to warn you. You did not listen." Davies stared at the photograph, trying to force his memory to work. Had he met Eleanor before her death? Had she tried to contact him? Why could he not remember? He checked his appointment book, his phone records, his case logs. There was no evidence that Eleanor had ever attempted to contact him, but the photograph was undeniable proof that they had been in the same place at the same time. Davies realized that his memories were not just being altered, they were being completely rewritten. Someone was systematically stealing pieces of his life and replacing them with blank spaces and foreign experiences. Have you ever had a moment where you questioned your own memory, where you were absolutely certain something had happened one way, only to find evidence that contradicted your recollection? Let us know in the comments, because what happened to Davies could happen to anyone. The psychological manipulation had reached its peak. Davies could no longer trust his own mind. Every memory was suspect. Every recording could be fake. Every photograph could be doctored. He was exactly where the killer wanted him to be. The final confrontation began with a phone call that Davies did not remember making. He found himself driving toward the abandoned St. Mary's Church on the outskirts of Havenwood at 11:30 on a Friday night. His hands gripped the steering wheel, but he had no memory of getting in his car, no memory of deciding to go anywhere. The last thing he remembered clearly was sitting at his desk, reviewing case files. The church had been empty for 15 years. Broken windows stared like hollow eyes. The front doors hung open, creaking in the wind. Davies's headlights cut through the darkness, revealing tire tracks in the dirt that looked fresh. Someone else was already there. Davies parked and checked his service weapon, fully loaded, safety off. He had no memory of preparing for a confrontation, but his body seemed to know what was coming. The interior of the church was a shrine to madness. Every surface was covered with Eleanor's research. Her handwriting covered the walls from floor to ceiling. Photographs of the 7 missing women hung from the rafters like accusations. Case files were scattered across the altar like offerings to some dark god. And in the center of it all stood a full-length mirror, reflecting the chaos back on itself. Davies walked slowly down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. The beam of his flashlight revealed more details with each step. Mathematical equations that matched the symbols from Eleanor's crime scene, maps of Havenwood with locations marked in red ink, timelines that connected all 7 disappearances across 4 decades. But it was the mirror that drew his attention. As he approached, Davies saw his own reflection staring back at him, exhausted, paranoid, broken. Then he saw something else. Eleanor Ainsworth stood behind him in the reflection, her eyes wide with the same desperate warning he had seen at the crime scene. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. She raised her hand and pointed at something Davies could not see. Davies spun around. The church was empty behind him. When he looked back at the mirror, Eleanor was gone. Only his own reflection remained. But now it looked different, foreign, like someone else wearing his face. "You understand now," said a voice from the shadows. Davies drew his weapon and aimed toward the sound. A figure stepped into the light, hands raised in surrender. It was Dr. Marcus Albright, but he looked different too, calmer, more confident, like someone who had been waiting for this moment for years. "Eleanor was brilliant," Dr. Albright continued, his voice carrying a tone of genuine admiration. "She figured out the pattern faster than any of the others. She lasted 3 months before her mind broke completely. You managed 4 weeks." Davies kept his weapon trained on Dr. Albright, but his hands were shaking. "You killed her." "I liberated her," Dr. Albright corrected. "Just like I am about to liberate you. The mind is a fragile thing, detective. With the right pressure applied consistently over time, it can be reshaped into anything we choose." Davies looked around the church again. The evidence covering the walls was not Eleanor's research. It was his own handwriting, his own photographs, his own case files, arranged in patterns that made no logical sense. "The recording at the crime scene," Davies said, understanding flooding through him. "Eleanor's voice, that was me talking." "You have been helping me document this experiment from the beginning," Dr. Albright explained. "Every conversation you cannot remember, every missing hour, every altered file, you were the one making those changes." Davies felt his grip on reality slipping completely. The memories started flooding back. Not memories of investigation, but memories of participation. Phone calls to Thomas Brennan, coordinating alibis, visits to Silas Crawford's motel room, planting evidence, hours spent in this church, documenting the psychological breakdown of Eleanor Ainsworth. Here is what we have learned about the human mind. It can be turned against itself. With enough isolation, enough doubt, enough carefully applied pressure, anyone can be made to question their own reality. The strongest minds are often the most vulnerable because they rely so heavily on their ability to analyze and understand. Davies heard sirens approaching in the distance, car doors slamming, footsteps running toward the church. "Detective Davies." It was Miller's voice, shouting from outside. "Come out with your hands visible." Davies looked at his reflection in the mirror one more time. Eleanor appeared again, but now she was shaking her head sadly. Her lips moved, forming words he could finally understand. "You were supposed to save us." The police entered the church with weapons drawn, flashlights cutting through the darkness. They found Davies standing alone in front of the mirror, his service weapon pointed at his own reflection. Dr. Albright was nowhere to be seen. But the evidence told a different story. Davies's fingerprints were on every surface. His handwriting covered the walls. His voice was recorded on dozens of audio devices scattered throughout the church. From the outside, it looked like Detective Alistair Davies had orchestrated an elaborate psychological experiment that had driven Eleanor Ainsworth to madness before killing her. From the inside, Davies knew he had been manipulated into becoming both the investigator and the perpetrator of the same crime. The question that haunted everyone who worked the case was simple. Was Davies the victim of an elaborate frame job, or had his mind been so thoroughly compromised that he had become a willing participant in his own psychological destruction? Detective Alistair Davies was officially cleared of all charges after 6 months of investigation. The evidence against him was deemed circumstantial, and multiple psychological evaluations concluded that he had been the victim of an elaborate manipulation scheme rather than its architect. But clearance and recovery are two very different things. Davies left the Havenwood Police Department and moved 3 states away. He took a job as a security consultant, work that kept him away from crime scenes and case files. But the case followed him like a shadow that refused to fade. The official files were sealed by court order. The evidence was locked away in storage facilities that required special clearance to access. The town of Havenwood returned to its preferred silence, and the missing women became footnotes in local history once again. Dr. Marcus Albright disappeared the night Davies was found in the church. His medical license was revoked, but no charges were ever filed because no prosecutor could prove what crime had actually been committed. The manipulation had been so complete, so perfectly executed, that it left no legal fingerprints behind. Davies still receives messages, not physical letters anymore, but digital communications that appear in his email, his voicemail, his social media accounts. Always the same voice, always the same message. We are not finished with you. Here is the most important lesson from this case. Psychological trauma does not end when the immediate threat disappears. The mind remembers betrayal. It remembers the moment when reality became unreliable. Davies carries that betrayal with him every day, questioning every memory, doubting every perception. He has learned to live with uncertainty as a constant companion. He records conversations. He documents his daily activities. He maintains relationships with people who can verify his experiences and validate his memories. These are survival strategies for someone whose mind was used as a weapon against itself. The killer is still out there, still practicing, still perfecting the art of psychological destruction. The method was too sophisticated, too precise to be a one-time experiment. Somewhere, another investigator is probably starting to experience what Davies experienced. Another victim is probably writing in their journal about feeling watched, feeling manipulated, feeling like they are no longer alone in their own mind. What would you have done in Davies's position? Would you have trusted your own memory when everything around you suggested it was unreliable? Would you have been able to resist the psychological pressure, or would you have become another victim of mental manipulation? Subscribe to Criminal Mind Cortex for more cases that will challenge everything you think you know about crime, justice, and the fragile nature of human consciousness. Because next week, we are investigating a case where the victim and the perpetrator were the same person, and the only witness was a security camera that recorded something impossible, a crime that defies logic, physics, and everything we understand about reality itself. The question is, are you ready to question everything you believe about the nature of identity?